That's good. This is a better time today because I haven't actually got started. Yeah, so here we go. Moving from the if my slides will advance, I don't know why they're not. There we go. Okay. So a couple things I want to point out here as we are dealing with sort of moving through time. When we gained our independence from Britain, when we won the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution, the country that actually benefited most from that victory was actually Great Britain. And of course, you could talk to most Americans, and they'll pump their chest and say, "Yeah, we beat the British." We fought a fraction of the British Army, a very small fraction. Great Britain was engaged in conflict around the world. They were becoming the predominant world power, and largely we won because they just gave up. They were just like, you know what? It's not worth it anymore to deal with these stupid people in these 13 colonies. They're more of a headache than anything else. So let's just let them go. There was some thought that we would come crawling back to them, which is another song in Hamilton that we didn't get to. But that was, largely how we won. We just outlasted them. We just became so much of a headache that they decided, let's just let them, it's just costing too much. It's too much of a hassle. We're going to give them their independence. What happens because of that, and we mentioned France was our big ally. They gave us a bunch of weapons and support. They went bankrupt, basically. They went in so much debt, sort of like Britain did during the 7 Years' War. France wound up really hurting themselves by helping us. And it removed them from any real influence in North America, right? They still had the territory, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, but it also sort of took them off the map as far as being a real rival to Great Britain. So thanks to the American Revolution, France goes in debt, and Great Britain basically becomes the dominating world power for the next century or more, honestly. They did so by controlling the oceans. We talk about land powers and sea powers in military history. Britain was the greatest of all time sea power. They controlled the water. They controlled shipping. They had a massive navy. And because France wasn't much of a threat for a decade or two, they just grew and expanded. And that's going to come back to haunt the U.S. Here as we go along. So after the American Revolution, of course, Britain cedes a good deal of what had been part of, they weren't colonies yet, but they were territory that Britain had claimed of North America. And you can see it on the map over here, that pink area. The problem I have with this map, it has the state outlines on it. But at that point, in 1783, those obviously were not states yet. You had just had the colonies in the states that were along part of the East Coast there. But that's showing you what the new United States gained as far as territory after the war. So automatically we were expanding. And so we start kind of growing. We start pushing out towards west with new territory. People are, moving and starting settlements, and that eventually becomes a bit of an issue. And then in 1803, right? I mentioned France was in debt. They needed to raise money, so they sold 828,000 square miles of territory to Thomas Jefferson, who was the president at the time, and that was the next great expansion. And you can see that in that purple color there, right? That whole swath of middle America. from Louisiana at the bottom up to North Dakota, and that reaches, that connects us with Canada, part of Wyoming, Montana, all of this over here. And then Spain also ceded. They gave us, we purchased Florida from them. So that happened in 1821. So this huge expansion of territory. That comes a bit of a concern with Britain, the sudden growth. And we, in that time period of 1812, before 1812, some of these settlements were pushing up against parts of Canada, and that was still British territory that was controlled by Britain. And on top of that, there was, besides disputes over territory, again, I mentioned Britain was the commander of the seas. They controlled trade, just really, anything moving across the oceans, they had played a part in it, honestly. And they tried impressing American sailors, and these were commercial ships, into duty with the British Navy. These were largely private ships, but also a very small navy. Something else to mention here: after we won the American Revolution, we were, this little backwater country on the other side of the important part of the world. We had our army fell to the size of about 1,000 soldiers. We had about 1,000 actual professional soldiers, and they were spread out across the colonies and into the frontier, largely fighting Indians or Native Americans at that point. And we had no real navy. We were just this tiny little, happy to be, independent from Britain, but we didn't have much way to defend ourselves. Like I said, we didn't have a navy really, and that's a lot of the idea behind the Second Amendment, which is, I can't remember the exact wording, but a well-regulated militia being part of the defense of the United States, whatever it says, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. The idea behind that is the families get to keep their guns in case Britain shows up again and you have to shoot them. That's the idea behind the Second Amendment. We need to have our citizens armed because they may have to fight Britain or another, rival. They may defend themselves, and that has been altered and debated over time. But that's really the spirit of the amendment. But anyway, so yeah, there's not, we don't have much way to defend ourselves. What we do have are two oceans. We have the Pacific Ocean, this huge body of water on our west coast, and we have the Atlantic Ocean over on our east coast. And that is this great barrier. Geography is what served the United States for so long to make us who we are, to make us rich, to make us powerful, because our rivals, we had largely taken care of. We didn't have to worry about France, who was an ally. Spain couldn't claim much in the way of territory or anything. They weren't a threat to the United States because it was so hard to get here. You had to cross an ocean, didn't have to worry. The Pacific Ocean is bigger than the Atlantic Ocean. We didn't have to worry about anybody coming from Asia really to threaten us. So we were allowed to just grow. We were allowed to use this tons and tons of resources that we have. You just think about what's available here in the United States, everything that we needed at that time. We had timber, we had coal, precious metals, every type of agriculture we could grow. We had livestock, everything we needed, and we didn't have to worry too much about people interfering with that. We weren't going to get bullied that much because, like Europe, where your rival is literally next door to you, you share a border. France is right across the English Channel from Great Britain, and Spain's there, and Germany. They have to worry so much about their defense. We didn't have to worry so much. So that helped us, allowed us to grow. But we did have to deal with Britain one more time. So the impressment of sailors was a big issue. Demanding they would raid ships on the sea, and they would tell sailors, "Well, now you're working for us." and then restrictions on trade. So as far as the way the United States was handling trade on the ocean and the sea. And so that led to the War of 1812. Won't get into a lot of details there, but it was about a 3-year war. There was not a lot. The Battle of New Orleans, which actually happened after we had signed the treaty with Britain, was a major win for the United States, but it made no difference as far as the outcome of the war. It was largely sort of a stalemate as far as, who won what, when. But what it did do was basically resolve our issues with Britain. And from that point forward, they understood that we were not going to be part of the British Empire, and we were going to be recognized as our own country. So it really solidified that idea. And so from 1812 or 1815, I guess I should say, from that point forward, we didn't have to worry too much about, other rivals showing up and trying to, claim territory. And we have, the doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine that comes along that, nobody's going to mess around in our backyard, meaning the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. We did fight a war with Mexico in the 1840s. And you can see there, that's where we annexed Texas. We basically, took Texas from Mexico. That's basically what happened. And then they also ceded more land in 1848, and Britain releases their claim to the Oregon Territory in 1846. So you could see there before we get to 1850, we went from coast to coast. We are now a continental empire, right? We're not going out and setting up colonies outside of our continental space there, but we are now basically in control from left to right, across the board, all of this territory. Here's where we're going to start having some issues, though, internally. So, as I mentioned, right, we've been expanding, and this idea comes along. It's coined in the 1840s, and we've talked about this before as well, manifest destiny. So it's this idea that Americans were destined by God, by the will of God, by whatever act, to spread across the country, for the continent of North America, that we were going to bring progress and fortune from East Coast all the way across West Coast. And that's largely what happened. We laid railroad tracks in the 1840s, crossed the country. We explored our territory. We set up new settlements along the way, and all the time we're pushing out. We're displacing Native Americans, and that's the real travesty in all of this. We're taking their land. We've moved them onto reservations. We've out and out had wars with them and killed them, and displaced, just entire populations of people. And of course, that had been going on since while we were colonies. That's been going on since the 1600s. But in this time, it's really sort of gained momentum. So, and then the picture kind of that painting, which is supposed to be, showing the greatness of America. And in its day, the idea there was like, oh, look at all the progress. You see the telegraph lines and the railroad coming and the stagecoaches, but then you see the buffalo running and the Native Americans running. And in hindsight, we see now, the damage that we did. So, so we're expanding and we're adding new territory, and that leads to new states. And here's where we're going to get into a lot of tension between the two sides. So I mentioned, the early republic. So that is the idea of from the time that we started governing ourselves, really before the end of the American Revolution, say around 1780, but when we were becoming our own nation, to the Civil War. That's the era really of the early republic. And we look a little bit different then as far as how we govern, our culture, but we're beginning to see this American identity form. The antebellum period, antebellum is Latin for before the war. So you'll hear that in reference to, particularly when we're talking about the pre-war conflict between the two sides, between the North and the South primarily. But that typically will refer to something involving, slavery, anti-slavery, and the coming war. So the antebellum period. 1812 seems a little early, but a lot of historians would use that. But certainly by the time we get to the 1830s and 1840s with expansion, that's really a big issue. So, of course, what we have are growing divisions. And this goes back to the days of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, and frankly, even before that. I mentioned sort of the division where we would hope that we wouldn't see the formation of political parties in the country, but that lasted to the second president, right? Because John Adams was a Federalist. George Washington didn't really have a party. He was more sympathetic to the Federalists, though. You got Washington on your side. So there continue those same sort of ideas, although the names start to change with the political parties. The Federalist Party falls apart. It's for a while that it becomes the Whig Party, WHIG. There's some scandals, there's some corruption, but it basically collapses. And what arises out of that with similar ideas is the Republican Party. The Democratic Republicans, largely still the same Democratic Republicans, but they basically become the Democrats. And obviously what else is important here is that those two sort of political ideas are also geographic. Most of your Republican, well, it might be a little early to start to actually call them Republicans till we get to the late 1850s, but your Federalist, your anti-slavery party, your party of sort of progress, technology, that's in the North. Your Democrats are the party of the South. They are the party of slavery. And so it's not just slavery that drives, it's a huge part of it, is the most important part of it, but there are other, cultural divisions between the two. As I mentioned before, the North is starting to industrialize. We're starting to see factories. The South is staying agrarian and it's relying on slave labor. There's technology that can do those jobs, and they're starting to be utilized in the North, but the South refused to adopt a lot of that technology. Things like in the cotton gin, for an example. Instead of having to separate cotton fibers from the seeds and the other part of the plant, you now have this machine that can do it, and it takes a fraction of the time and a fraction of the manpower. And this type of technology is being utilized much more in the northern states. But the economy of the South largely relies on cotton. There's other goods that, tobacco, sugar to some degree, rice to a small degree, but cotton is the primary resource that comes out of the South. And it is there's a huge international market for it as well. It's relatively new material. A lot of before that, wool was, a lot of what people wore, and you can imagine wearing wool in the summer. There wasn't, unless it was either your cheaper fabrics that tended to be heavier and rougher and itchier, or you had really expensive fabrics like silk. But you're not going to be able to afford that. Cotton bridged the gap. It was a durable fabric. It was lighter weight. It was great for summer. And it was less expensive. So it became really popular around the world. And we had the South that was providing a lot of it. Now, of course, there's other places in the world that can grow cotton, but that was what the South used to continue to drive the idea that they needed slave labor. It's like, we have this huge market of cotton. Cotton is so important around the world, and we're providing it. We're going to continue using slave labor. So you have this cultural, you have this economic idea. A lot of it is coming back to slavery. Now we get to adding states, right? So here is where the big political division is really comes about when it comes to slavery. Because who's going to have, are you going to add new states as slave states, or are you going to add them as free states? Most of the North have started to abolish slavery. Also worth noting, globally, slavery is starting to die. The institution of slavery is dying around the world. Britain and France are giving up slavery. And that doesn't make them saints. I should probably point that out. Yes, they saw the evils of slavery. They still have colonies all over the world, and they treat the indigenous people, they treat the native people there very badly. But they are, this is adding pressure to the South because they're starting to see the institution of slavery die. The United States and Brazil are the last major economic powers in the world who will have slave labor by the time we get to the 1850s. So now it's a problem with, okay, we have these territories, we're going to add states. They have to become states. They're going to have, they're going to set up governments. And along with that, they're going to have representation in DC. This is where the battle gets serious when it comes to slavery. So the first compromise comes way before this overall expansion. You may have heard of this. You may have heard of some of these. So the 3/5 compromise in 1787. So they're starting to look at, well, how are we going to divvy up representation? And remember, I mentioned this. We saw this, when we talked about civics in our federal legislative body today, right? You have 100 senators. We have 50 states, 2 senators per state. That does not change. If Puerto Rico became a state, they would get 2 senators. We would have 102. The House of Representatives is based on population. It's capped now at 438. How many U.S. representatives? 435. I was off by 3. There's 435, and that number's pretty much been capped. So as your population changes, so I think we talked about if Ohio loses a significant amount of population, if they lose a certain number, and then that number it shifts to Pennsylvania or West Virginia, whoever it may be. So Ohio would lose a representative or however many based on the population, and then Pennsylvania or some other state would gain one. They're going to stay capped at 435. But, those census, I mentioned they're really, really important that we do every so often, because that determines, how many representatives each state's going to get. And then I mentioned states like Montana and Alaska, these states that have very, very low population, they basically get a token representative. They don't even have enough population to have one representative, but because they are a state, that's the way we have to have them represented in the U.S. House. So when they started thinking about census, the South was like, hey, well, we got all these people, we're gonna have all kinds of representation in the House because we have all these people. And then the North said, well, wait a minute, all those people are slaves and they're not treated like you deny them rights, and they don't have voting rights. So why would we count them in the census? And that was one of the early compromises to relieve some of the tension between the two sides. So as ugly and gross and nasty as it sounds, they treated every slave as 3/5 of a person. They weren't going to give them count them as a whole individual to add that many people, to add the population up so that the South would get that much representation in the House of Representatives. But they're willing to sort of cut a deal so that they would at least get counted as some amount of population. it's sickening to think that we're thinking of people as fraction of people, but the whole idea of slavery is just awful, and it's we have to deal with it. But that was one of the early compromises made. Then we get to the addition of states, and again, this idea is coming up, right? So obviously, if you're going to enter the United States as a state, and you're going to have you're going to be a slave state, well, the problem then that the North worried about was that, well, you're going to wind up having 2 senators who are pro-slavery, and however many representatives you have that we add to the House, they're going to be pro-slavery. And of course, the Southerners were worried about the same thing. Well, if you enter these new states as free states, then you're going to get 2 senators who are anti-slavery, and your representatives are going to be anti-slavery. So it becomes a really tense political battle. This is where a lot of the fighting was done, was deciding, well, if we enter one state, so we wind up with a series of compromises. The Missouri Compromise, 1820, meant that Missouri got to enter the United States as a slave state. Maine entered as a free state. Okay. The 1850 Compromise was similar. I forget which 2 were there. And then the final one was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was the same thing. But there was a lot of issue with Kansas, whether or not Kansas was going to be a slave or a free state. And as a territory, this period between 1854 and 1859, we call they'll call it Bloody Kansas or Bleeding Kansas, because there was a lot of partisan violence, particularly on the borders with Missouri, which had already been entered as a slave state. There may have been up to 200 deaths associated with these anti-slavery groups fighting with pro-slavery groups and determining if Kansas was going to be a free state or a slave state. So the tensions are mounting. Our presidents, Pierce and Buchanan, might be 2 of the worst presidents of all time, because they continue to allow the United States approach civil war. It just the tensions kept mounting. We do, as I mentioned, we have the emergence of the Republican Party in the 1850s that come out of the ashes of the Federalist and the Whig Party, that are very staunchly anti-slavery. And then the final tipping point with the South deciding to leave was the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And of course, he becomes president March 1861. He's inaugurated in 1861. He was elected, sort of around the same time that we have our elections at the end of the year before. And that, at that point, the South knew. With the election of Lincoln, he was very staunchly anti-slavery. He campaigned on it, eliminating slavery, that the South was in trouble. So we come to secession then, the final straw. So come on, slides. I want my slide. Here we go. All right. So secession. Now this is the final act. They could not agree. Slavery was the one issue. No matter what any lunatic wants to tell you about the Civil War, about secession, it came down to slavery. That was the one issue that was not going to be resolved. So before Lincoln takes office, he's already been elected, South Carolina secedes. They draw up papers to secede. They have a conference, and they decide we're going to leave the Union. So December 20th, 1860, they make up their own little, if you want to call it a Declaration of Independence, whatever it is, Declaration of Succession, and they decide they're going to leave the Union. Before Lincoln takes office, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas follow South Carolina between January and February 1861. The map will show you. So all those dark blue states are the ones that left between, starting with South Carolina in late 1860, and then the rest of the blue in early 1861. And then we have what's basically the first battle of the Civil War. It's the Battle of Fort Sumter, April 12th and 13th, 1861. So part of the problem here is that, all these, you have, particularly along the coasts, where we had defenses set up in case there was like an invasion. You could travel up and down, frankly, anywhere. I'm going to Niagara Falls this weekend. There's a fort right off of Niagara Falls from 1812. But there's a series of forts that were used to defend against any invasion that were occupied by Union American troops. So Fort Sumter, you had Union soldiers there that were stationed within Charleston, South Carolina. There had been some sort of small outbreaks of violence against those Union soldiers, and so they fled to Fort Sumter and were holed up inside the fort. Jefferson Davis, who was the new president of the Confederacy, called on, what was that general's name? Beauregard, I think it was PGT Beauregard, to bombard the fort. So that became the first battle. And so they were, trying to overtake the fort, lay claim to this, what had been a Union a fortress. So Lincoln, who's now in office, is trying to drum up volunteers they think this is going to be a short-lived, skirmish, conflict. They wanted to try to reclaim the fort, put an end, sort of squash this Southern uprising before it got out of hand. But what really comes out of that battle, that just 2-day battle, was really bolstering the resolve of both sides. It led to more Union nationalism, the idea of American sort of patriotism. We're not going to allow, these roughnecks from the South to, destroy the Union. And in the South, it made Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina decide that, well, we're not going to be a part of the Union anymore. We also want our freedom from the United States. So they joined the Confederacy shortly after that. So the Battle of Fort Sumter really solidifies the two sides, that we are going to, draw the line in the sand, so to speak. We're going to have the South move to the Confederacy. Virginia becomes Richmond, Virginia becomes the capital of the Confederacy through most of the war. It's I think it's less than 100 miles from Washington, D.C. That's how close the two capitals were. And then, of course, like we see, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina joins, and you could see in the map there, there were several slave states that did not leave the Union. Maryland was a very key one that the Union wanted to make sure they kept. Kentucky and Missouri. So they were slaveholding states that stay with the Union. Why do you think it was important for Maryland, for the Union to keep Maryland on its side? Anybody want to take a guess? No takers? Where's Washington, D.C.? It's inside Maryland, right? So by not keeping Maryland, you would have had to move the capital. You would have been surrounded by a hostile neighbor. So there was concessions made to some degree to Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland as far as slavery was concerned, because they needed them strategically to help bolster the Union, the Union itself, basically. So now we have two sides, right? We have our seceded states from the Confederacy, and we have the Union. Lincoln is not going to let this happen. He declares, and along, of course, with any Republicans and most of your northern politicians, that what the South is attempting to do is just simply illegal, is unconstitutional. They cannot leave the Union. And you still have some people that want to debate whether or not that's, was legal. But then it's going to come to trying to get them to return, and that's going to lead to open warfare. So now we have our two sides. And so there's several, and I actually have the fellow on the left there, that extremely attractive gentleman, is William T. Sherman. And the guy on the right is Robert E. Lee. I put Sherman there. He is not the commander of the Union Army. He commands one of the Union armies. But yeah, nice clothing too, right? But I put him up there because we actually read some of his letter, remember, to the mayor of Atlanta, and just wanted to use that, to show, sort of bring that back to what we did in class. He's also, I mentioned, he's an Ohioan. You can visit his childhood home in Lancaster. And then the gentleman on the right is Robert E. Lee, who took command fairly early on. There was a commander of the forces before Lee, but fairly early on, he takes command of all Confederate forces. Now, with that said, there are commanders of particular armies, but generally speaking, Lee was responsible for strategy, along with Jefferson Davis, the president. Robert E. Lee was also offered, before joining the Confederacy, command of the Union forces. Lincoln asked him to command the Union forces. He said, "I'm a Virginian. I'm going with Virginia." So when they seceded, he joined the Confederacy. So, and we're all better off for it, because as it turns out, he wasn't as great as a general as people like to think he is. There was several commanders for the Union. Do you remember the political cartoon we looked at, where we had Lincoln on one side and Jefferson Davis on the other, and there was that guy in the middle with the mustache? That was George McClellan, who at the outbreak of the war was the commanding general of Union forces. A big problem with him is that he was very hesitant to use his army and his men in battle. And early on in the war, we took some lumps. The Union took a lot of lumps because they weren't aggressive enough. Lincoln wanted him to push harder, and he wasn't doing that. Before we get to Grant doesn't take control of the armies until 1863, I think. And Sherman is part, basically, of his staff and controls one of the armies in the South. I won't get into a whole lot of detail about that, but I just want to use him because we've talked about him before. And honestly, look at those two guys. Who do you want to win your war for you? You want the guy on the left, the grizzly veteran, or do you want Albus Dumbledore? So anyway, some statistics here about the war. I'm a U.S. military historian. I could literally fill an entire semester with just talking about the war. I've taken classes that took an entire semester just to talk about the Civil War. But just some of the highlights and how things were fought, how the battles went, and things like that. So they call it the last pre-modern war and the first modern war. because the way troops were moved, the way they acted on the battlefield, were often like what we saw before in the Revolutionary War, where you have rank and file soldiers that line up with their muskets, and they load their muskets, and they shoot at the guy, and then they load their musket, they shoot at the guy. But with improvements in technology, we started getting away from that. Rifles got much, much more deadlier. They got more accurate. You didn't want to stand and try to take a volley from a Springfield rifle because they were so accurate at such a long range. So that started to change over the course of the war. And by the end, so we had 2.2 million Union soldiers serve during the Civil War. Now, that's not all at one time. That's from the course of 1861 to 1865. At its peak, there was about almost 700,000 active soldiers that would have been on the battlefield. For the Confederacy, you can see not nearly as many, 750 to about 1 million. At its peak, it was about 300 some thousand, I think. And then the casualties. So this was, and still is, the deadliest war in American history for Americans. You know, we fought in World War I, we fought in World War II, but as far as number of casualties go, we did not accrue that many casualties in World War I or World War II. Vietnam was over 50,000. And here we're talking about 365,000 Union soldiers, 290,000 Confederate soldiers, and 1 million, you know, estimated total casualties with soldiers, civilians, and slaves. The deadliest killer in the war was disease. You had about 110,000 Union soldiers actually die on the battlefield. The rest of those casualties succumbed to disease. The second biggest killer was captivity. So prisoners of war, if they were taken by Confederates, they were put into camps, and you know it was either malnutrition, neglect, or disease that killed them there. But when it was all said and done, we were looking at the loss of probably 1 million lives of American lives. So by far the deadliest war in American history to date. And then, you know, like I said, it was the last pre-modern war, and there was new technology. So things like the railroads. It was the first time railroads were used to transport soldiers and goods to battlefields. There was over 200 named battles during that 4-year period, all up and down, you know, the country, out west, largely in the South, but it was everywhere. And the thing here, I have approaching total war. And this is why Lee was a bad general, and Sherman and Grant were much better generals. And you can also see by the total of Union dead as opposed to Confederate dead, there's part of that too. The nature of war is changing here too. And it's been that way ever since. So, you know, largely up until, especially in Europe, you think about the Revolutionary War, you think about some other wars, the Napoleonic Wars in France are going to be more like this, but most of your deaths were just soldiers that were, you know, fighting on a battlefield. You beat an army, then you win the war. The Civil War changes that. It's more about taking the war to the people. And Sherman and Grant understood that. They knew that they were going to have to destroy the will and morale of the Southerner, not just the Southern soldier, not just the Confederate soldier, but the will of the people to fight the war. And Lee was more old school, believed you just had to fight the army, maybe take the capital, and you would win. You know, Sherman, his famous quote is "War is hell," And he understood that, we have to take it to the people. They have to understand that they cannot support this war effort anymore. And that's where we get his March to the Sea. So the letter that we read, where he's telling the mayor of Atlanta, you need to evacuate your city because I'm going to burn it to the ground. And that's what he did. So it's not nearly as bad. I mean, you hear about Sherman's march to the sea and him just burning his way through the South and the destruction. It's not like he flattened the entire city, but he understood we have to destroy their will to continue to fight. And that becomes the idea that is taken into war into the 20th century. That is why war in that time frame, World War I and World War II, is so deadly, because it wasn't just the soldiers on the battlefield. It became the idea that every person of that country is part of the war effort. And as we get to those wars, more people are involved in the war effort. More people make wartime goods, and more of the economy is allocated for those goods. In the Civil War, not as much. So that's why I say it's approaching total war. That idea, certainly in World War I, and we'll talk about that probably Monday or Tuesday, is much more like the idea of total war, where every citizen of the country is part of the war-making effort. Lee, you could, say what you want. Maybe he was a little more honorable in that regard. We mentioned that as well, that, he refused to, he paid for his, when they would forage. So if an army is on an expedition and they need goods, they'll quote unquote forage, maybe take, from a farm or something like that. And he would refuse to just sort of steal from a farmer, and he would pay them with absolutely worthless Confederate money in the Union. That was his way of saying that he's honorable, I guess. But anyway, so kind of rambling here about the war. So the worst amount of casualties the United States has ever seen lasts a little over 4 years. And then finally, after the Battle of Antietam, Grant meets Lee on the battlefield. He surrenders on April 9th, 1865. So they're still fighting after that for several months. It goes on. Jefferson Davis refuses to surrender, who's the president. They move the capital for a while, and they drag it out for as long as they can. But for all intents and purposes, the war's coming to a conclusion around that time, around April 9th, 1865. And then that will lead us into the era of Reconstruction, where we'll have to deal with bringing these southern states back into the Union. How are we going to do that? I kind of glanced over the Emancipation Proclamation. I didn't really talk about that, which is issued by Lincoln later on to free the slaves. We'll talk about that on Monday, and we'll get into sort of that other side of it, where, what happens now, what happens with this previous slave population, and deal some more with, the fallout and the resolution of the war. So let me ask you guys, do you have any questions about how we got to the Civil War, what caused the Civil War, and as far as the resolution and the Union victory at that point? Any questions there? Yes, so slavery. That was, like I said, Patia, that's the biggest part. Unfortunately, there is continues to be a debate about, the reasons for the Civil War. People there, there's apologists out there. There's people that try to undermine or I mean, I'll just say undermine, but they smooth over and soften what, the idea of the South and what the South was about. That's something else. I should mention here. So what becomes of the memory for the South, and this plays into what's happening today, is the idea of the lost cause. And it's an idea that was perpetuated after the war. It started in the late 1800s, where it really gained steam. That the idea of the Southern struggle, their reason to secede, their reason to fight the war was about states' rights, and it was noble and just, that they had a right to secede, and what they were doing was because of states' rights. Everybody's quick to point out states' rights to do what? Right? To own slaves. It always comes back to that. We read some passages from the vice president of the Confederacy, who, in no mixed words, just straight up says, a Confederacy, our secession from the United States is to continue, and I'm paraphrasing here, this isn't an exact quote, but basically to continue our superiority over the Black race. He puts it in those types of terms. And that's unfortunately been perpetuated. The idea, and I have friends I went to high school with, from West Virginia, that will argue up one side and down the other that the South, their fight was for states' rights, and it was the lost cause. It was noble and just. And then I remind them that, I have a graduate degree in American history, and they're probably wrong. But yeah, so that's, and we know there's a big push to remove statues now of Robert E. Lee, and, Stonewall Jackson, these various Confederate figures. And you'll occasionally get the same sort of argument that, you're removing history. Statues, memorials, monuments, that is not history. That is memorialization. It's a part of, our understanding of history, but memorialization is preserving a memory. It's not preserving history. It's preserving the recollection of the past, not the study of the past. And a lot of people are getting, bent out of shape over that. But in reality, the reason those statues were put up was to help perpetuate that idea of the lost cause. They were put up, sort of to thumb their nose at the Union and Northern Republicans in the 1800s and early 1900s that had punished the South because of slavery and because of secession. So that's my short version of what's going on. And when we get to Monday, we'll get into more of Reconstruction. We'll get into, the 13th and 14th Amendment and offering, the freed slaves, the right to vote. So any questions? I hope this is helping. Does it help connect the dots with what we did earlier in lessons? Yes or no? You want me to stop? You want me to move on to something else? How do you feel about it? Okay, I got a thumbs up. Good. Okay.
Yeah, good.
Okay, good. So if there's no questions, it takes a while for me to get slides together and everything. So that's why we've had some sort of shorter lessons. But I'll have some time later on this weekend to work on a little, maybe longer. And down the road, once we get through the history part of it, I'll work this in because we wanted some map exercises. So I'll keep that in mind when I'm thinking about map activities with what we've done with history. Okay. Any movies like about the Civil War? Let's see, what's a good Civil War movie? Glory. is a good one. That is about a black regiment during the Civil War. I have to think about that, but that's one you might want to check out. It's got a super good cast. I think Denzel Washington's in it, and Matthew Broderick, and Andre Bauer, and all kinds of people. So yeah, check out Glory. That's a good one. Lincoln, the movie about President Lincoln is really good too. That was played by Daniel Day-Lewis. Did he play Lincoln? I think so. Yeah. So that's a good one. That's more recent too. Lincoln, not Lincoln Vampire Hunter. That's a good movie too, but it's not very historically accurate. Okay. Anyway, so you guys have a good weekend. We'll pick up on Monday with Reconstruction. We'll see how far we get then. All right.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.